Hey friends, it's Allison. Quick note before we hop into the episode. My Facebook account was recently hacked, both my personal and the negative space. And so if you have been following either of those accounts on Facebook, I no longer have access to them. And so sometime soon, what will likely happen is that the negative space page on Facebook will shut down and I'll have to restart a new one. And what I really don't want to lose any of you. And so if you could do me a huge favor, go to www.thenegativespace.life/subscribe and then fill in your email address. That way, once everything is all back up and running, I can email people and say, here's where to find me on Facebook, so that none of you are lost in trying to follow this page that will no longer be able to be updated anymore. Thanks, friends. Enjoy the episode.
You're listening to In Sickness, a podcast about caregiving with Allison Breininger and Justin Bima.
Good morning.
Good morning, Allison. How are you doing these days?
I am better today than I have been for a bit.
That's great to hear.
Yes, I know last time we were together, I gave the update that, they did find some cancer in Sean's esophagus.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had to wait a long time before we got the PET scans, and we have to wait even longer before the surgery. So that I had I don't know how many days, but some days where I was like, my nervous system, it's done.
Yeah.
It's toast. It's fried. Just being in this waiting, right? And the unknown. But last week we did get the PET results and they were all good.
Oh, great.
So that's good that it has not spread in any way.
Yeah.
And so that felt huge.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're still in this waiting. We have 2 weeks until his surgery. And we know that the surgery still has a lot of unknowns and it's going to be super unpleasant and it's going to be, and he has to stay in the hospital and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
But at least having the scans out of the way has made me feel much, much better.
Good.
So I've had a lot of rough days, but then I have also these last few days felt much more back to myself. And I'm just sort of in a moment of like, okay, we'll just get through these next 2 weeks and enjoy these next 2 weeks. And then November will be what November will be.
Yeah.
Which I somehow could not do before we got the scan results. I was just in too much like panic mode. But that's where I am today. So I'm enjoying it.
Good.
I mean, enjoying feeling better.
Yeah.
I guess. So, yeah. My kid turned 17. That's a big deal.
Whoa. That's a big
deal. I know. She's the best. So, and it's just all these sort of lasts of like, next year on her birthday, she'll be in college.
Right.
So, yeah. So she's pretty delightful.
Yeah.
Also makes me lose a lot of sleep. But just by the nature of being a teenager.
Yeah. I can imagine.
But it's just amazing. So that's been really fun. Plus, it's like the best possible time to be in Minnesota right now because it's the leaves are ridiculous. I mean, it's like you can't even take in that like this is real, that these trees are real.
Okay.
And the sky is blue and it's just amazing. But I did look at the 10-day forecast and there's snow and that makes me very sad.
Here we go.
So we're just trying to soak up these last few days as much as we can. So that's kind of where we are today. How about you? What's going on over there?
Not a lot is going on. As I mentioned before, early October was really busy for me. So we've kind of entered into a little more quiet season, which I am very grateful for.
Good.
And so that's been good. But kind of overall, I don't know. Winter's coming, the darkness with that, just kind of feeling apprehensive. For most of this year, I've been doing TMS on kind of a maintenance schedule of twice a week, which has been a lot to do. And so Tuesday is going to be my last session for that. We're going to kind of see, because the improvement has stopped a while back for a while. And so it's like holding steady, but do I still need it to maintain that? And so it's like, you got to find out. Yeah. So we're going to see what happens.
Yeah. So hard though with all the different factors, right?
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's getting to be darker and it's this and it's that. And so, if you have a harder time in the next couple of weeks, is it like, well, is it because of this? Is it because of that?
Yeah.
So hard. But yeah.
Yeah. So just kind of, I don't know, feeling in a little bit of limbo to kind of see how all of that shakes out and just trying to rest as much as I can too.
Yeah.
kind of feels like a season of that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of accept that that's kind of where things are at and just kind of rest.
Yeah.
So
it makes me think of that book. Did you read the book Wintering?
No, but I'm familiar with it, and I think it's on my list of things to read.
Yes, you might want to bump it up higher.
Okay.
So just because it's just about, I think it's Catherine May is the author.
Okay.
And it's just about like how like the much of the natural world does this wintering thing, and they slow down and they rest and they hibernate, and how like it kind of doesn't make sense that we as humans are just like, we're going to go with the same amount of energy, even though it's winter. And so it sort of like gives permission to like, actually, it's okay to slow down,
Okay.
So I found it really lovely one winter. And you and I were talking earlier about daylight savings time. And I was, because for me, I'm like, the earlier it gets dark, the sooner I can get in my bed with my electric blanket and my book. So I sort of am embracing that. It's like, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
But that's because it's only October. So talk to me in January when I'll be like weeping under my covers because I haven't seen sunlight forever. But yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So as far as what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah.
You had an appointment with Sean. I don't know when it was, sometime since we last talked.
Yeah.
Where you said that you were at the clinic for 7 hours.
It's a true story.
I think it was Mo's procedures maybe, or
it was.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that's a long time to be at an appointment. And I was just imagining like, how do you get through that?
Yeah.
One, just like, I mean, that's like spending a full workday almost at a thing. I know that Mo's procedures are not particularly great, both for Sean to endure and for you to witness.
Correct. Yeah.
So like that much of that has to be a lot to kind of endure. So I was just kind of thinking, what if we talk about the appointments that we have to take our people to and kind of what we do to prepare for that, what we do to get through it or navigate the appointment itself. And then afterwards, we've talked about, you have this hangover the next day and like, how do we recover and kind of find our way back to where we were after kind of going through this thing that we often, I don't know, for a lot of us, that's just a continuous thing, these appointments.
Right.
And they don't stop, and we don't necessarily want them to, because they're hopefully what brings improvement, what finds answers. Yeah. But they can be a lot. Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah, I was hoping we could kind of talk about that today.
For sure. And it's interesting, you and I were supposed to do this a week ago, and that appointment was still so raw for me that I was like, I don't think I can do it. Because partly, so there was 6.5 of the hours were for Mo's procedure, which is awful. But then what I realized in that is that I have somehow gotten used to that level of trauma. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah.
But, sort of not immune, but, used to, I guess, because we've done it so many times. But the last 30 minutes was like a new level of horrific in which, and if you have sensitive ears, listeners, you might want to just like, mute this for a minute. But, he had these like precancers on the bottom of his eyelids.
Right.
And they like cauterized them. They use like a burning element on his eyes. Oh. And he was awake. And I was right there with him. And it was terrible.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is like, I left that appointment like feeling like actually shell shocked, like what just actually happened to me. So yeah, that's a whole thing. So I want to say that like today, as we talk about appointments, like that's like an appointment.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
like ooh. And a routine appointment can also just be, can be hard in its own way as well. And so we're talking today not just about that kind of thing, which I hope doesn't happen to people very often or at all.
Yeah.
But I think the whole range of what appointments can look like. But also I think something you brought up that's important is that like so many of us as caregivers, there's multiple appointments a week.
Right.
Often. So it's not just like, oh, once a year I go in for this thing. Like we are going back and going back and going back. And I think an important thing that you brought up that I wrestle with a lot is that like, this is supposed to be like a place of healing. And like, we're actually asking for this and we're actually like paying for this.
Right.
But it's actually awful.
So it's like this form of like torture, but yet we're going there on purpose. So I think that's a whole psychological layer of the doctor appointment thing.
Right.
You know, it's just that it's like, this is, we're going because we want it and we need it and we whatever, but it's also terrible.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think let's kind of think about like the before, the during, and the after, right? Because I think all of those stages are important. And so when you think about like before appointments,
yeah,
you know, like if you see like, okay, it's Monday, on Friday afternoon, we have an appointment. What are sort of the things that you find that are like, what does that feel like to you knowing it's on the calendar? What is, you know what I mean? All of that is you're like looking ahead and you know an appointment is coming.
Yeah. So, I mean, these days it's much different than it was, you know, several years ago.
Sure.
Both in that we have fewer appointments and that they are much less taxing on Sarah.
Yeah.
Which makes a big difference. And also since COVID, so many of them now we just do telehealth.
Yes.
And that has made an enormous difference.
Yes.
So I guess maybe that's a first thing, like, can this appointment be a telehealth appointment?
Exactly.
When you're scheduling it, something to think about.
Yeah.
And if they, you know, ask, you know, and I know that depending on the conditions that the people we're caring for have, that may or may not be possible.
Sure.
But that has become much more of a normal option in the medical world. And if that works, take advantage of that.
Agreed. Yeah.
So that's one thing. So the other thing would be like, so there's an appointment coming up, looking at our schedule, looking at the calendar, what's happening around that, or even as things are coming up and there's an appointment on the calendar, keeping those things away from the appointment day. Can we, as much as we can, and it's not always possible, to clear our schedule around that, both before and after.
Yeah.
Because if you're coming off of a busy day beforehand, like, one, you're not going to feel as prepared. Two, you're going to be tired from that. So that's one thing.
Yeah. And I think, may I hop in for a moment?
Yes, absolutely.
I think even with the telehealth, we can be tempted to be like, oh, it's telehealth. So I'll just like do a work meeting from 11 to 12 and then telehealth from 12 to 1 and then another work meeting from 1 to 2. And I think that's because we can get lulled into the fact that like technically we could do that.
Right.
Right. Because there's no drive time and there's no whatever. But what I want us to think about today is like, what does that do to our psyche? Right. To switch in our brains from like work thing to caregiver thing to work thing.
Right.
You know? And I think that especially, I mean, we can have that whiplash even if it's in person, but then we have sort of the drive time that sort of transitions us a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Whereas if it's a telehealth, you could just sit at the very same computer at the very same desk. The person just joins you for an hour. Suddenly you're like totally doing this shift. Right.
Yeah.
And that can kind of mess with your head a little bit.
Right.
You know, to think that we can manage it just because the calendar looks like we can manage it.
Yeah.
You know,
that's a good point.
So I think what you just said, even in that place, doing a buffer around it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's good. So, I mean, I think another piece of preparing is just, you know, I can speak for when Sarah was really sick. Leaving the house itself was an ordeal.
Yeah.
And there's something about leaving the house for an appointment that felt like the stakes were higher, or there was another component to it. I don't know. Whether it's the emotional component of like, will we find an answer here? Will we get more information?
Yes.
Will it feel like we're still treading water? Like those expectations that like, how much hope do I put in this appointment? That kind of thing. So, I mean, that's all like, you're sitting with that all leading up to it, in addition to the preparing to leave the house.
Yeah.
I don't know I don't have like this is how best to navigate that, but I just kind of want to acknowledge that is a added piece.
For sure. It's a huge piece. Because it's like we are doing everything we possibly can to care for our person, but we are not medically trained, right? We need this other person who has this expertise to either like do the test, read the results, give us the advice, look at the lab, or you know what I mean? Like we need them. And like our whole life and well-being hinges on what it is that they say, right? Like if they could say like, oh, it's this, and that takes us down a totally different path. Or, oh, I don't have the answer, which means we are on the same path that we don't want to be, right? And so you're right. The stakes are so high for these appointments. And so we can like be like, oh, well, maybe on Friday we'll have an answer.
Yeah.
Right. And we put so much into it. And then I think, and we can maybe get into this, but what that can feel like when there isn't an answer.
Right.
When the doctor's not kind, like all of those things. But I think that it's probably undervalued or under talked about like the anticipation that we might feel looking at that towards that appointment to be like, to get the answers, to get the advice, to get the results, to get the, next steps kind of thing,
Yeah, because I think it can feel like we've extended ourselves as far as we can. We've reached our limit, and we have to get help in that regard out beyond that. And so it's like you're reaching, and you want something out of that.
Yeah,
and that's hard to hold that, I guess. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I think the other thing with preparing for an appointment is just the like logistics of leaving the house. And I know that when Sarah was really sick, we kind of came up with a system of, we had an appointment bag.
Yeah.
And, one thing in there was we kept an up-to-date med list and like allergy list, so that when you get to the appointment, you can just hand that to them, because they always want to go off your meds.
I know.
Go over the meds every time. And it's like, I don't know, it seems like they should not need to as much as they do sometimes. Like they should have that information, but I get it. So just offloading some of that kind of stuff and just having it documented and keeping that up to date. But then, there were other things that she needed or would be helpful to have, whether that's like just some basic like Tylenol and ibuprofen if she needed that. She needed like a sleep mask in the cars because it was too overstimulating to see everything flying past, some things like that. And so having that, so we didn't have to like every time, okay, what do we need, gathering it together. It's one less thing to be trying to do. And then some of the things, it didn't make sense to have like a separate thing in the bag. So there was a pocket that had a card, and it was, here's the things to grab beyond what's in this bag. And so that made a big difference because it always felt like every time I'd be like coming up with a list from scratch of like, okay, this is what we need to do to prepare. And when you start, for me, being in that like planning mode, it engages kind of that anxiety kind of like part of my brain. And it's like, well, what if this, what if this, what if this? And like getting
what if I
stuck
forget
in that. Yes. All of that. So putting in that work made a big difference for us.
Yeah. And I think too, there's some things that like maybe at one appointment you realize like, oh, you know what? Earbuds were really helpful for him. Right. But then by the time it's the next time, you're like, oh, you forget that. Right. And so I think, like you said, having that written down to be like, this is something we found that really worked.
Yeah.
Because some of those days we kind of block out, like for self-preservation. And so then it's not till the next time you're like, those earbuds would have been really helpful. Right. Yeah.
I think something that we had put a topic similar to this on our list of potential topics a while back, and you had added a comment like, what's in there for us? And that was just like, whoa, because I had never thought of that.
Whoa, really?
Like, yeah, I had never thought like, oh, what can I put in this bag that's for me? And so as the caregiver, think about that. Like, what do you need that day?
Right.
And I think about that with you, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Like, you probably need things to get through 7 hours of being at the clinic. Like, you can't just sit there.
Yeah.
So like, yeah. So think about that when you're preparing.
That is pretty mind-blowing, friend, that you...
Yeah.
We're like, wait a minute, I might need something too.
Right?
So when you think about that now, like going back, and I know you're not in a season at this moment where you're going to a lot of appointments, and so maybe you've put the bag away in a closet or something, which but if you were to add some things to that bag for you, what would it be?
That's a good question. I might, sometimes you're waiting a while for an appointment to start, throwing in like my Kindle. So that, I could read a little bit, or if, Sarah's back having a procedure done or getting some scans or something, that I could do that. Something, maybe some snacks that I really like.
Yeah.
So that there's something that I, enjoy in there, something for me. Yeah, I think I'd have to kind of get back into that mode of like what those appointments were like to kind of think through all of what I would want.
Sure.
But I think just the idea of I am important in this, that I should be preparing myself to go through this thing as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Amen. Yes. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you said snacks that you really like, because I think snacks we think about, because it's like that happens all the time when we have these most procedures that we like get there at like 7 or 8, and then we're like, well, we'll be done by lunch. Nope.
Right.
And then it's like 2 or it's 3, and we're like, oh my gosh, And so part of it is just like nutrition. Is there something? Because often what I do on those most days is that during some of the waiting times, I go down to the coffee shop and I get like a coffee, and then like I always get like this giant like chocolate muffin, which is delicious, but probably not like the most like sustaining. But so I think it's good to have like stuff that's going to sustain you, but also I like how you said snacks you really like.
Yeah.
So that when you're sitting there, you're like, ooh, my favorite gummy bears or whatever, A friend of mine the other day sent us this care package, and we were talking about, I was joking about how the chocolate that she sent in it was like not going to last very long here in this house. And she sent me a picture of a little like prescription bottle that her friend sent her once. And on the side of the bottle, it said like, take as needed or something. It was full of chocolate. And she said, I used to just I had this in my purse, and I used to only take it on appointment days and procedure days. And I was like, that's a dumb rule. You should take it every day. But I think there's something to being like, there's a little something special about it. Like when Sean was going through radiation, there was this drink I found at the coffee shop that was a green tea matcha latte with lavender. And it was delicious. And so we went every day for like 30 days.
Right.
And every day I would get one for myself. And it was sort of this like, if we're going to do this terrible thing, I'm at least going to have this comforting, delicious drink. So I think part of it is like we want to be sustained, and we want to like, like make sure our blood sugar is good and all that good stuff. But also I think we want to make sure that we like, is there a way we can sort of treat ourselves?
Yeah.
In an extra way during that time, Yeah.
Yeah. I think the last piece maybe to talk about with preparing is kind of the like medically preparing for it, or like having notes, like what do we want to get out of this meeting or this appointment? What is the specific questions we want to ask? Because I don't know, for me, if I don't have that written down, like in the moment, in the appointment, I'm not great at like remembering.
Sure.
These were the specific things that we wanted to make sure we cover.
Yeah.
And so, have that conversation with the person you're caring for. What are, so you both are on the same page as far as what are the expectations for this appointment? What are they looking to get out of it? What answers do they want? So that if they can't participate actively, what to voice on their behalf.
Yeah.
So to do that preparation, make those notes, I think is helpful to get the most out of this often limited time that we have in front of a doctor to kind of try to get some answers.
Yeah. And I think you bring up such a good point. It's like we are anticipating, preparing. They like waltz in. We get like 11 minutes with them, and they waltz out, right? And then we're like, oh, right?
Yeah.
And so you're right that like the more preparation that we can do beforehand. And I think you bring up an important point about getting on the same page with your person.
Yeah.
Right. And even saying like, I've noticed XYZ about, you in the last few weeks. I was thinking we could bring that up, or, so that the first time they hear you say that isn't in front of the doctor.
For sure.
Or that you're not sharing something and they're like, wait, you know what? You're saying that to somebody, And so like to really get on the same page, I think is important. And then you said to bring questions, and then also to bring, to have those written down. Cause you're right. We get into our like anxiety brains, and then we're like, I don't have any questions. And I think doctors, when they see you pull out the notebook and they see that you have the questions, I think that sort of sits them down a little bit more than if you're just like, I have a casual question, when they're like, oh no, they came prepared. I better sit here and listen and answer these questions. But then also to bring something to write their answers with.
Exactly.
Or to record, like, it's okay if I record what you say, so that later on, we can just because sometimes afterwards you're like, what did they say?
Yeah. And the notes never really fully capture the conversation that you get afterwards.
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I want to, before we go into like the appointment part, I want to also just note the piece about working, right? So you and I are both like working caregivers, and the majority of people are. Mm-hmm. And like what this feels like to like have to take time off or have to reschedule things, and how challenging that can feel. And then do you like tell your employer like, oh, I'm taking my wife to the doctor, or are you just like, I need PTO? And then if you use up all your PTO on the doctor's appointments, then you don't get to ever take a vacation, right? So I think that's a whole piece of it.
Yeah.
Is that these appointments happen during the work week. And we need to like figure out how to manage like our workload and the appointments at the same time. And that can feel like a lot.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we do all our anticipating. Pack our bag. We got our questions. And then we get there.
And we wait.
So that's a big one, right? Is that like waiting is a big deal. And so even when we think about working caregivers, like, I have had times where I'm like, okay, well, this appointment cannot take longer than X number of minutes because I'm leading a session at X time. You know what I mean? Like I have come like dressed to the nines, like ready to like the second we leave there, like race home and like jump on the,
Yeah.
And you don't want to feel like insensitive to your person and their needs. But at the same time, like we got to balance all these things, right? Yeah. So the waiting, oh man, the waiting is so hard.
Yeah.
And how they put us through that and how it can feel like it, because it's like, this is the most important possible thing to us.
Yeah.
And all the waiting and the whatever can feel like it's not the most important possible thing to the provider, which can feel like a sad disconnect.
Right. Yeah. So getting through appointments, I don't have as much experience as you unfortunately do with these marathon like things. I mean, for me, other than the waiting to get called back, which actually I'm going to mention something there. There was a time when Sarah, like sitting was difficult for Sarah, like laying down was where she kind of needed to be. So part of getting to the appointment would be, checking in and say, hey, is there an empty exam room she can lie down in? And making that and voicing that. And it wasn't always an option, but often it was. And that made a huge difference for her.
Yeah.
And so it's okay to ask for something like that.
Yeah.
To make your person as comfortable as possible during that waiting for the actual appointment.
I'm so glad you said that because so often, you're going to the doctor because your person feels like garbage, right? And so then it feels so terrible to like take them in the car and through this thing and sit in a lobby and all of this when they're feeling terrible, right? And so asking for things like that, or the wheelchair or the whatever it might be, or to say like, look, we might not, even if it means we have to sit and wait in that room for a long time, like, can we wait there instead of here or whatever? Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, there's that initial waiting part. Then, you go back, you talk to the nurse, and then you wait for the doctor.
Yep.
And so it's like, those are like the lulls in the appointment to like wait through for most of my experience. And so it's not getting through the appointment other than like being prepared going into it and sticking to, the notes and all of that. That's kind of been most of what it is. There have been a couple times where when Sarah got her central line put in while she was back, I went, to the cafeteria and got some lunch, kind of did something different, broke away and kind of that. So I don't feel like I have as much on that.
Sure.
But I know it's maybe not the most fun thing for you to talk about, but I'm curious, like, what did you do during that 7 hours? Because that's a lot.
It's a lot
you can't just sit there and watch it all for that long. And I imagine there's waiting time involved in that too, because they're removing stuff and then going and inspecting it and all of that. But that's a long day.
It's a long day. You're right. And I choose to be in the room.
Yeah.
Most people don't for this. But I I just want to be there, and he wants me to be in there. So I'm there in the room. Mm-hmm. So I have learned, I try to bring a light physically, but also like topic wise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Something that's, not triggery in any way and sort of light and something I can come in and out of.
Right.
I try to I was like that day, I was like texting with some friends about lighthearted things, and that was helpful.
Good.
I always, like I said, at one point during one of the waiting times, I always go down to the coffee shop and I get like a fancy drink and a fancy snack. And then while I'm down there, I always go outside.
Okay.
Because the room that we're always in is windowless.
Right.
So I go outside and I just try to like sit in the sunshine for even like 5 minutes.
Right.
And then I feel a little bit, like I should be, I can't wait too long. Right. Mm-hmm. But I just know, like, I try to soak up some of that sunshine. I try to like breathe the air. I try to like be in a different space than I have been in. I always try to use the stairs because I just feel like I'm sitting for 7 hours and this could be helpful for me. Mm-hmm. And nobody else is using the stairs. And so then it's kind of like a nice time by myself. You know what I mean? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's one strategy that I use. I think it's interesting. Like we know this doctor so well. And so we often talk about like what TV shows we've all been watching.
Yeah.
But then this last time Sean wrote something, he writes beautifully, by the way, and wrote something about like, as they're slicing me up, they're talking about TV. And later I was like, I'm so sorry. Because I've said that before. Does that feel weird?
Yeah.
That like we're here talking about what we're watching on TV. And he's like, no, I have my earbuds in. You just all do what you got to do. But he did mention that. And I can imagine how that feels, that it just is like, it feels like he's not a human. It just feels like he's just like this prop. Right. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we try to like engage with them, with the providers about chatting. But then that, like I said, that sometimes can feel really like out of body a little bit,
right?
Like disconnected, that they're like slicing him open and we're talking about like Halloween costumes or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I sort of go back and forth with that. I always try to bring water and I try to bring some kind of like meal bar kind of snack kind of thing because I know I'm there for a while. I try to bring earbuds for him for sure.
Right.
That's like a lifesaver for him. And then sometimes for me.
Right.
As well. I have that Apollo Neuro bracelet that we've talked about that you and I both have. And for sure I have that on.
Right.
And that's just like a nice sort of buzzing kind of thing that I'm able to do. I think that might be it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, part of it is sometimes even just like the fun conversations. Like I texted a friend about like, how do we feel about overalls in middle-aged women? Like, is this a thing that we should be doing or not be doing? And, so some of it is just like escapism, right? Of like, but then also, I'm obviously very open on things like social media. And then that can help because as I'm sitting there, it can feel less lonely because then people are texting and messaging and saying, we know you're there today and we know this is hard and we're thinking of you. And so that can help as well. So
yeah, I can imagine that there would be a tension between the like needing to have that escapism, needing to like go outside and get some fresh air for yourself. And the person I love is enduring this and I should be there next to them, supporting them through the whole time.
Exactly. Yep.
Which is kind of, I mean, that's the tension of caregiving in a lot of ways is like, what do we need? But we want to always be there for our person. And it's kind of a heightened place where that is being played out. I'm glad that you're able to know that you need to do some of that for yourself. And I'm sure that wasn't always the case. And you've been through this a lot, unfortunately, and kind of have learned the hard way, probably what's best and how to kind of manage it. But that's probably not to say that it makes it easy at all.
Right. And it's funny because I find myself wanting to be like, I'm not going for that long, Justin. I find myself like wanting to like defend myself and be like, well, it's only like 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Which is like, yes, Allison, it's fine to be gone for 4 minutes or 8 minutes or 12 minutes of 7 hours.
Right.
But it's kind of funny how there's something inside of me wanted to be like, wait, no, I am a good caregiver, even if I go outside for a minute,
Right.
But I think I feel like that even more so when I'm sitting like in the room, like reading a book.
Right.
Like that feels weird that I'm like looking down and I'm turning pages and like, should I be staring at this like every moment? Should I be holding his hand every moment? You know what I mean? Like, So, and we've talked about that, like what's the most helpful to you and all of that. But sometimes that feels weird to be like turning pages while this is happening. Cause it's like, should I be like so present, you know? But he too is like zoned out. Like he's got his earbuds in and he's like doing his thing. And so, yeah. But I think another piece of it too is the advocacy piece of seeing things like asking, like, can you get him a heated blanket? Or like, I can sense that he is in pain and because he's so sweet, he might not always say that. Right. So I think that's another piece that we haven't talked about is just the being on. It's not just sitting there and being present, but it's being like, did you remember that you were going to whatever, or last time we talked about, or what about this research thing? You know what I mean? So it's like all of those advocacy pieces that are part of it as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lot for us to be doing during an appointment. That is exhausting. And I think that's a big part of why in the time after the appointment, like we're wiped out.
Yep.
So the appointment's over and you get your person home, and it's a tough spot because they're wiped out. They're exhausted. This has been hugely taxing for them. So they're recovering in that sense. You know, if they had a procedure done, there may be some like actual healing and wound care that needs to go on as part of that we are managing. And so often there is heightened caregiving responsibilities in the aftermath of an appointment.
Yep.
And we've been through a lot as well.
Yep.
And we need time to process and to recover and all of that. And I think that one thing, that's what I mentioned at the beginning, like if you can have your schedule clear in some time after that, so that just to limit the amount of other stuff that is vying for your attention during that time.
Yeah. And your energy.
Yeah. Can make a big difference. But I know that for me, kind of what would happen is Sarah would be exhausted after the appointment and she would sleep a lot.
Yeah.
And so I would also rest.
Yeah.
Whether that was, actually taking a nap or just like checking out and watching something light on TV or something like that, but not using that as like, okay, now I can catch up on things around the house.
Right.
I have an opportunity to like, go through the to-do list, trying to resist that and be like, I also need some time to rest and recover as well. I think that's an important thing to remember.
And that's so much easier said than done, right? Because I think like we come home from that day, he's got like the actual wounds, right? He is like all wrapped up and bandaged.
Yeah.
So of course he walks in the door, goes straight into the bed.
Yep.
But for me, it's sort of like, well, I'm not bandaged. Like nobody sliced and diced on me. So then it's like, I feel like, well, what's wrong with I should go make the dinner and, clean the house and do the thing and go to work. And you know what I mean? And I think you're right that we have to remind ourselves. That's why this like catchphrase of mine is like, you're part of the story, right? Like I was impacted by sitting there that day. I don't have any like bloody wounds to show for it.
Right.
But in some ways that's harder because everyone assumes and like expects like, of course Sean needs to rest for the next few days. Of course he does. Right. And no, and that's like not an assumed thing that I should come home and go right to bed because I'm not all wounded up.
Yeah.
Visibly, and yet like my psyche was, and energetically I am. And so I think both that the rest of that day, but then also the next day. And we've talked a lot about like that hangover day is what I call it. Because like in the moment, we're just like holding it together. Right.
Yeah.
And so then it's the day after that often it feels so much worse. And it took me a lot of years to figure this out and to block off the day after a procedure. And that can feel really hard because that's like 2 work days.
Right. Yeah.
And so then you're like, oh, do I really want to take off 2 work days? But I have just found that second day feels pretty awful. Right. And we just need that rest. And so that's why even thinking about like just blocking off work just for the appointment can feel really both energetically, but also this sort of like mental whiplash of like, so 2 hours ago, I was in this appointment talking about my husband's health. And now I'm in this meeting looking at spreadsheets. Like, what is this world?
Right.
And so I think we need to be kind to ourselves. And I know that is easier said than done, and that I'm very fortunate now and that I am my own boss. So I don't have to worry about that anymore. But I did for a lot of years. Right. And so I know that we can't always give ourselves that kind of wiggle room. But I want to say that when we can, it's so, so helpful. Mm-hmm. And so I think, too, even thinking about like, we'll get here into supporters, but I'm just going to jump into this, is that that's a place where we can like look ahead on the calendar and say, look, we've got a bunch of appointments on Thursday. Can someone bring us dinner on Thursday and Friday?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Because Friday, we're also going to be feeling like garbage. So to ask for like, what are those helps that we can put in for those appointment days? Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
One more thing I want to bring up as far as the after appointments, and Sarah reminded me of this morning, is as she got stronger, it was still a ordeal to get out of the house. We would tag something on to the end of the appointment, something fun.
Yeah.
Since we had already done the work to get out of the house.
Yep.
So that might have been, sometimes that was getting takeout from a restaurant and eating it in the car. And sometimes that was, we'd stop at the bookstore and she could browse for a little bit. But something to, I don't know, counter the heavy emotions of that day, or just to, if that is a limited opportunity for you to get out, like, can you can you add something to that, build some time to also make it I don't know, for us, it would be like a little date. So something, I don't know, something to think about.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I think there's so many things my brain is thinking about, like so many directions that this could go. And I know it's almost time to wrap up, but so just a couple things I just want to like drop out there, and then we can decide later if these are whole extra topics. Right.
Yeah.
But things like, how do you process when you're in the appointment and the doctor is unkind? Not compassionate. You get bad news, like all of those pieces. Right. So we just sort of have talked through the logistics of like being in the heart appointment, but like some point maybe we could dig into like, what about what happens in the actual appointment with the news, with the interaction with the medical professionals, right? I think is one piece. I think another really important piece to acknowledge is the trauma around these spaces, these physical spaces.
Right.
And so like for me, going back to that same building, to that same hallway, to often the same room with the same people over and over again is terrible. Right. And so I think that sometimes even just these buildings that we're going into, they're spaces of healing, and we have to like try to remind ourselves somehow that they are there for good, but they are also the buildings in which we have often had some of our worst conversations and some of our worst medical moments. And so it can feel really hard to even walk into the building and be in the spaces and smell the smells and park in the parking lot, all of those things. And so I want to acknowledge that layer of it as well, is that it's like going back to the scene of the crime in some situations, right? Over and over again.
Yep.
And how heavy that can feel. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
That's important. So as far as supporters go, you kind of already alluded to can be very helpful is dinner the day of an appointment, dinner the day after an appointment.
Yep.
Or showing the day and days after an appointment is a great time to show up as a supporter and take things off a caregiver's plate.
Yep.
So, if you are supporting a caregiver, one thing you could do is ask, hey, do you have any appointments coming up? And if so, then can I bring you dinner, whether it's the day of, the day after? Or can I do this other thing for you that day? Or, can I drop off dinner? I said that already, but that's going to be really helpful.
Yes, totally. Or like, can I, pick up your kid from school that day if you have an appointment? Or, is there something around that would be helpful? Yep. I think another piece that we didn't really get into, but that supporters can be mindful of, and this is especially for maybe like more inner ring folks, but is that sometimes when we go to appointments, that's about new information. And so the people in the next rings are all like, what happened? What'd you find out? What's going on? And then the caregiver has to like tell everybody what happened, right? And that is exhausting.
Yes.
And so if you're if you're not the caregiver yourself, just be patient and don't, be texting it like 501 and say, okay, I assume you're home from the appointment. What happened? What did they say? How did it go?
Mm-hmm.
Call me. Right.
Yep.
And just to be like, they'll share the information when they're ready to share.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so instead to do more of like I know you had an appointment today, and you, Justin, are so good at this, at keeping track of dates and things. And I appreciate it so much that you'll be like, I know that today is Sean's procedure and I'm thinking of you and no need to respond. Right. And so I really appreciate that when people remember dates, you know, and remember that before me even having to tell them. And so just reaching out, I know that this is happening today, thinking of you, da, da, da. Or maybe it's the end of the day. I know the appointment was today. Hope it went as well as it could. Thinking of you, no need to respond, whatever. But I think just honoring what those people have just gone through, the caregiver and the patient, and to not like be like, well, what happened? What happened? Tell me everything. Yeah. Which is I'm saying, I'm like, I was terrible at that with my mother-in-law, because I would be all day like, what happened? What happened? What happened? And then I would or feel like I was probably, you know, pushier than I should have been about like, so what happened? Right. And that's why things like social media or like the Iana Care app has a whole section where you can like give an update to everybody on your team at one time, which is like amazing. Yeah. So I think that's one way you can help as well. I think another thing that supporters can think about is to recognize that even if the news was good at the appointment, that it still took a toll. Right. So not to be like, oh, you went to the appointment? Oh, it was good news? Great. I'll cancel dinner for tomorrow night or whatever, you know, like to be like, just even if when the news is good, like just the preparing for it and getting there and getting through it and getting home is a lot on both people. And so to not just like, you know, blow off the fact that this happened, even if the news at the appointment was good. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think one more thing that you brought up a little bit earlier is potentially being available during the appointment. Yeah. To be that lighthearted. Well, I guess two things. To be that like, not lighthearted, but not intense like conversation to have with the person that could be distracting, could be an escape. Yep. You know, it could be cute cat videos or, you know, as you said, talking about overalls or whatever it is. Right. But to like, if you know that they're at an appointment and they text you with something, like to make that a priority to engage with them. Yeah. Totally. So that's there. And maybe to ask them, say, or offer like, I know you've got this thing, this procedure or this appointment. And if you're waiting and you need some distraction or you need something like that, like I'm available for that. Love it. And to kind of know what would be helpful for them. Is it more helpful to offer that distraction, or is it more helpful for them to know that you're like, I know you're going through this. I know this is hard. Like I'm thinking of you, and because I can imagine that if you're just getting a ton of that, like that's heavy. Yeah, exactly. In some ways, it's also wonderful. Exactly. Yeah. But sometimes you need both. And so just kind of, being available as needed to support the person during the appointment. Right. It was funny. I could tell my overall friend was a little confused, like, because she knew that we were in this appointment. And then I was texting her about these overalls. And then, so she said something a little bit like, I just want to acknowledge that I think you're in a really big appointment right now, but we can talk about overalls if that's what you want to talk about. Yeah. And I was like, yep, that's what I want to talk about. She's like, okay. So I appreciate sort of the like check-in, right? Yeah. And that she didn't have to take it. Because you're right. Sometimes I'm like, I just want to not be heavy about everything. And I just want people to like talk to me about stuff, not this, you know? And so it was nice to sort of have that option. So good. So I feel like we like talked about a lot and also just scratched the surface of a lot of things, which is kind of right. You know? Yeah. But I think that we did get a lot of, you know, we started. I think from this, I think there's a lot of other things that we could talk about. So actually, listeners, as you're listening, if you're like, oh, well, I think there's more about this or more about that, always just reach out and let us know. And we're always, you know, open to ideas. And so you can just let us know what things that you wish that we would dig into a little deeper or things like that. So, or share with us what's in your go bag or how do you get through your appointment days or things like that. That would be helpful for us all to learn. So, yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if who knows if it'll be before this or after this, but so Sean's surgery is on November 6th. And so I'm going to take some of these because that will also be a lot of waiting and sitting. Yeah. And so maybe we'll get some good ideas from people as well about like more things that I can put in my bag and the anticipation and all of that. But hopefully this can kind of help me get ready for that as well. So yeah. All right. Well, good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye. You've been listening to In Sickness. Find us online at insickness.care or on Instagram at insicknesspodcast. You can send your questions and comments to insicknesspodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or fellow caregiver, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and take care.